The air inside the Jade Room was a thick, intoxicating blend of expensive oud and the metallic tang of hidden agendas. Amara Okoye adjusted the strap of her silk slip dress, the emerald fabric shimmering like oil on water against her deep skin. She didn't belong in a place where the entrance fee cost more than her rent, but a promise to her best friend had brought her to the belly of the beast. "Just drop the envelope at the bar, Amara. Don't look at anyone. Don't talk to anyone," she whispered to herself, her voice swallowed by the low, thrumming bass of the house music. She moved through the crowd with a feline grace, unaware that the sea of tailored suits and designer gowns was parting for her, not out of respect, but out of curiosity. She was a flash of lightning in a room full of shadows. Up in the mezzanine, draped in the velvet darkness of the VIP booth, Jae-Min Kang sat motionless. To his right, a mountain of a man whispered about shipping manifests and territorial disputes in Busan. But Jae-Min wasn't listening. His thumb traced the rim of a crystal glass, his cold obsidian eyes fixed on the woman currently leaning against the obsidian bar downstairs. "Who is she?" Jae-Min's voice was a low rasp, cutting through his lieutenant's briefing like a blade. The lieutenant paused, squinting through the haze. "Nobody, boss, just a girl, probably looking for a high roller to pay her tab." Jae-Min watched as a local mid-level enforcer approached her, his hand reaching out to possessively grip her shoulder. Jae-Min's jaw tightened, his sharp features hardening into a mask of redirected violence. He expected her to flinch. He expected her to melt into the floor in terror. Instead, Amara didn't even turn around. She caught the man's wrist, twisting it just enough to elicit a wince before she pivoted. Her gaze was level, her chin tilted upward in a silent challenge that screamed of a woman who had never been told she was prey. "She's not looking for a payday," Jae-Min murmured, a slow, predatory smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth for the first time in months. "She's looking for trouble." As if she could feel the weight of his stare, Amara's head turned. She looked up, past the gold-leafed railings and the smoke, directly into the shadows where the Reaper sat. Most people looked away when they realized Jae-Min was watching. Amara didn't. She held his gaze for 3 heartbeats, steady, defiant, and dangerously unimpressed. Jae-Min set his glass down with a definitive clack. The rules of his world were simple. What the Reaper wanted, he took. And right now, the only thing he wanted was the woman who refused to fear him. "Bring her to me," he commanded, but gently. "I want to see how long that fire lasts before I put it out." The heavy velvet curtain of the VIP lounge fell shut, sealing out the rhythmic pulse of the club, and replacing it with a suffocating clinical silence. Amara had been escorted away by 2 men who moved like ghosts, leaving Jae-Min alone with his shadow, Dae-ho, a man whose loyalty was written in the scars across his knuckles. Jae-Min stood by the one-way glass, his reflection ghosting over the image of the empty bar stool where Amara had sat moments ago. The heat of her defiance still hummed in his veins, a sharp contrast to the icy discipline he had spent a decade perfecting. "She's been placed in the holding office, boss," Dae-ho said, his voice gravelly and devoid of the fascination Jae-Min was currently fighting. "But you need to look at this before you go in there." Dae-ho slid a tablet onto the mahogany table. A digital file blinked open, displaying a grainy photograph of Amara laughing outside a courthouse, her arm linked with a man in a crisp, authoritative uniform. Jae-Min's eyes narrowed. He recognized the man instantly. Samuel Okoye, the newly appointed police commissioner, who had built his career on the singular promise of dragging the Kang syndicate into the light. "Amara Okoye," Dae-ho stated, the name landing like a sentence. She isn't just some civilian who wandered into the wrong gen. She's the commissioner's blood, his only sister. Jae-Min didn't move. He traced the line of her smile on the screen, his mind calculating the sheer magnitude of the risk. To touch her wasn't just a breach of protocol. It was a declaration of war that even the underground might not survive. The board is already talking, Jae-Min, Daeho continued, stepping closer, his tone dropping into the territory of a warning. They saw how you looked at her. They saw you bring her in. If the commissioner finds out his sister is in a cage owned by the Reaper, he won't send a warrant. He'll send a strike team.
Jae-Min's hand curled into a fist, the black dragon tattoo on his hand shifting as his skin tightened over his knuckles. The logic was cold and undeniable. She was a liability. She was a match dropped in a warehouse full of gasoline. "There are two ways this ends," Daeho whispered, leaning into Jae-Min's peripheral vision. "You kill her now to send a message of strength, or you forget she exists and throw her back to the street. Anything else is a death wish." Jae-Min turned away from the screen, his gaze landing on the heavy steel door that led to the office where Amara was waiting. He thought of the way she had looked at him, unbroken, radiant, and utterly unimpressed by his crown of thorns. "I've never been good at forgetting, Daeho," Jae-Min said, his voice a low, dangerous vibration. He walked toward the door, the warning hanging in the air like smoke. He knew the cost. He knew the stakes. But as he gripped the handle, he realized that for the first time in his life, he didn't care about the Empire. He wanted the fire. The night air was a sharp contrast to the suffocating luxury of the Jade Room, but Amara didn't stop to breathe it in. She hurried down the rain-slicked alleyway, her heels clicking a frantic rhythm against the pavement. Jae-Min had let her walk out of that office, but the weight of his gaze still felt like a physical brand on her skin. She had reached the end of the block when the hair on her neck stood up. A black sedan with tinted windows crawled along the curb, its headlights extinguished. Two more figures emerged from the shadows of a recessed doorway ahead of her. These weren't Jae-Min's polished soldiers. They were jagged, smelling of cheap cigarettes and desperation, members of the rival Xinhua circle. "The commissioner's sister," one hissed, a switchblade snapping open with a lethal click. "Imagine what your brother would give to get you back in one piece." Amara backed away, her heart hammering against her ribs, but her eyes remained fierce. "He'll give you a prison cell and a shallow grave. Step back." The men laughed, closing the distance, but the sound was abruptly cut short by the roar of a high-performance engine. A silver coupe screeched around the corner, pinning the attackers in a blinding halo of LED white. The driver's side door swung open, and Jae-Min stepped out. He didn't look like a businessman anymore. He looked like an executioner. He didn't waste time with words. Jae-Min moved with a terrifying, liquid efficiency. He caught the first man's throat, the sound of collapsing windpipes sickeningly clear in the quiet alley. With a brutal pivot, he disarmed the second, snapping the man's wrist before driving a knee into his chest with enough force to crack ribs. It wasn't a fight. It was a harvest. In seconds, the threat lay crumpled on the asphalt. Jae-Min stood over them, his chest barely heaving, a smear of blood darkening the cuff of his white shirt. He turned to Amara, his expression a terrifying mix of fury and relief. "I told you to go home," he rasped, his voice vibrating with a dark, possessive energy. "I was trying to," Amara snapped, though her hands trembled. "I didn't ask for a guardian angel with a body count." "I am no one's angel, Amara." He stepped into her personal space, his scent, sandalwood and iron, enveloping her. He reached out, his gloved hand gripping her chin to force her to look at the carnage behind him. "They know who you are now. If I leave you here, you're dead before sunrise. Your brother's badge can't protect you in the dark." He opened the passenger door of his car, his gaze brooking's no argument. "The street is no longer safe for you. You're coming with me." Amara looked at the car, then back at the man who had just dismantled 3 people without blinking. She realized with a sinking heart that the threshold she had crossed wasn't just a door. It was a point of no return. She stepped into the car, and as the door thudded shut, the locks engaged with a finality that signaled the end of her life as an outsider. She was in his world now. The estate was a fortress of glass and cold stone perched high above the city's glowing arteries. To anyone else, it was a masterpiece of modern architecture. To Amara, it was a high-tech tomb. She paced the length of the expansive master suite, her bare feet silent on the heated marble. Every door was locked by biometric scanners, and every window was reinforced with ballistic glass that turned the world outside into a distant, unreachable dream. When the heavy oak double doors finally groaned open, she didn't shrink away. She stood her ground in the center of the room, draped in a silk robe that felt like a shroud. Jae-Min stepped in, shedding his suit jacket.
He looked exhausted, the sharp lines of his face deepened by the shadows of a long night spent cleaning up the blood she had inadvertently spilled. "The Xinhua are persistent," he said, his voice a low vibration that seemed to hum in the floorboards. "They've put a price on your head that would tempt even my own men. You stay here until I say otherwise." "You don't get to decide that," Amara countered, her voice steady despite the adrenaline spiking in her veins. "You're not protecting me, Jae-Min. You're collecting me. There's a difference." Jae-Min crossed the room in 3 predatory strides. He stopped only inches from her, his presence an overwhelming heat that forced her to tilt her head back to maintain eye contact. "If I were collecting you, Amara, you'd be in a cellar. Instead, you're in my home, eating my food and breathing my air. Be grateful." "Grateful for being a prisoner," she spat, her dark eyes flashing with a fire that made his pulse stutter. She pressed a hand against his chest, intending to push him away, but her palm landed over his heart. It was beating fast, furious and erratic, betraying the calm mask he wore. "My brother is probably tearing the city apart looking for me. When he finds this place, your protection won't mean a thing." Jae-Min's hand shot out, his fingers tangling gently but firmly in the hair at the nape of her neck. It wasn't an act of violence, but one of absolute, suffocating possession. He leaned down, his lips brushing against the shell of her ear. "Let him look," Jae-Min whispered. "Let the whole world look. They can bring their armies and their laws, but they won't take what is mine. You think you're independent, Amara, that you've been mine since the moment you looked at me in that club. You just haven't admitted it yet." He pulled back, his gaze dropping to her mouth with a hunger that was more dangerous than any rival gang's blade. Amara felt the walls of the room closing in, not from the stone and glass, but from the magnetic pull of a man who broke every rule he ever made just to keep her within reach. She wanted to scream, to fight, but as he lingered in her space, the defiance in her chest began to melt into something far more treacherous. The morning light filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows in shards of cold silver, but the tension in the room remained thick enough to choke. Amara had found him in the private gym, a minimalist space of steel and glass. Jae-Min was shirtless, his back to her as he worked a heavy bag with rhythmic, punishing force. Each strike sounded like a gunshot, echoing the violence inherent in his soul. As he moved, the shadows on his skin shifted, revealing the intricate tapestry of ink that she had only glimpsed in passing. She stepped closer, her breath catching. It wasn't just art. It was a map of a war zone. Jae-Min stopped, his chest heaving, sweat glistening on the broad expanse of his shoulders. He didn't turn around, but he knew she was there. He reached for a towel, his movement exposing the black dragon wrapped around his ribs, its claws digging into his skin as if trying to hold his heart together. "You're staring," he rasped, his voice raw from exertion. "It's hard not to," Amara replied, stepping into his space. She reached out, her fingers hovering just inches from the jagged scar that cut through a field of black peonies on his shoulder blade. "This one didn't come from a needle." Jae-Min finally turned, his gaze heavy. He didn't pull away when her fingertips finally brushed the puckered skin. A small shiver ran through him, not of fear, but of a man being touched for the first time in years without the intent to hurt. "That was the night I stopped being a son and started being a soldier," he said, his voice dropping to a low, haunting register. He gestured to the ink on his forearms, names and dates written in a script so fine it looked like veins. "My father was a nobody in the syndicate. He tried to get out, tried to give me a life like yours. They burned our house with him inside. I had to watch the smoke rise while I hid in the crawl space." Amara's hand stilled. The monster in front of her suddenly had a face. A boy forced to build an empire of ash just to ensure he'd never be small enough to hide again. "The tattoos aren't for decoration," Jae-Min continued, stepping closer until his heat radiated against her. "Each one covers a wound I couldn't heal. They remind me that loyalty is a lie, and mercy is a luxury I can't afford."
Amara looked up at him, the defiance in her eyes softening into a painful clarity. The Reaper wasn't just a title. It was a cage he had built for himself long before he ever locked her in this estate. For a fleeting second, the cold, calculating mask of the Mafia boss slipped, revealing a man who was utterly, terrifyingly alone. "You think you're protecting yourself with all this," she whispered, her hand moving from his shoulder to his cheek. "But you're just burying yourself alive." Jae-Min closed his eyes at her touch, leaning into her palm for a fraction of a second, a silent admission of a hunger that went deeper than skin. In that moment, the power dynamic shifted. He wasn't her captor, and she wasn't his prisoner. They were just two people standing in the wreckage of their own worlds, realizing that the only thing more dangerous than the war outside was the way they were starting to need each other. The silence of the estate felt different now, less like a tomb and more like a shared breath. Jae-Min had left for a summit with his lieutenants, leaving the heavy scent of his cologne and the echo of his confession behind. Amara sat in the study, her eyes tracking the movement of a security guard on the lawn below. She knew this room. She knew that beneath the mahogany desk lay a hard-wired emergency line, a relic of a previous owner that Jae-Min's tech team had overlooked in their pursuit of digital perfection. Her fingers trembled as she pulled the hidden panel free. The dial tone was a scream in the quiet room. She punched in a number she knew by heart. "Samuel," she whispered when the line clicked open. "Amara, my God, where are you?" Her brother's voice was frantic, the sound of a man who had been living on caffeine and terror. "I've got half the city under surveillance. Give me a landmark, a street name, anything. I'm coming to get you." Amara started, her gaze drifting to the monitors on the wall. The security feed for the back perimeter flickered. She saw them, not the police, but shadow-draped figures moving through the tree line with the practiced silence of professional killers. They weren't wearing her brother's uniform. They wore the sigil of the Xinhua. They weren't there to rescue her. They were planting thermite charges on the structural supports of the West Wing. In 10 minutes, the room Jae-Min was heading toward for his debrief
would become a furnace. "Amara, talk to me," Samuel barked. "I have a tactical team on standby. Just tell me where you are." The words died in her throat. If she gave Samuel the address, the police would storm the gates, and in the chaos, the Xinhua would detonate the charges. Jae-Min would die in the crossfire, or Samuel would be forced to pull the trigger himself. She looked at the desk, at the life she was supposed to return to, and then at the screen, where the assassins were closing in on the man who had bared his soul to her. I made a mistake, Sam," she lied, her voice cracking. "I'm in a moving car. I don't know where I am. I'll call you back when we stop." "Amara, don't you dare hang up." She slammed the phone down, her heart roaring in her ears. She had just betrayed the only family she had left. She had chosen the villain. Lunging for the internal intercom, she bypassed the secondary security layers she'd watched Jae-Min use. Her voice rang out through the entire estate, sharp and commanding. "Jae-Min, get out of the West Wing! The perimeter is breached! They're blowing the supports!" She didn't wait to see if he heard her. She threw open the heavy study doors and ran toward the sound of the impending explosion, knowing that by saving the Reaper, she had just set her own world on fire. The world dissolved into a deafening roar. The explosion tore through the West Wing, sending a shockwave that shattered the glass railings and knocked Amara to her knees. Dust and pulverized stone filled the air, tasting of copper and heat. Through the ringing in her ears, she heard the rhythmic thud, thud, thud of suppressed gunfire. The Xinhua weren't just bombing the house. They were coming in to finish the job. She scrambled to her feet, her lungs burning. "Jae-Min!" She found him in the wreckage of the hallway. He was pinned beneath a fallen support beam, blood slicking the side of his face, but his eyes were wide and focused. He was trying to reach the handgun that had skittered across the marble floor, just out of his grasp. 20 feet away, a shadow detached itself from the smoke. An assassin raising a rifle, his finger tightening on the trigger.
Amara didn't think. She didn't weigh the morality of the law or her brother's badge. She lunged, her fingers closing around the cold steel of Jae-Min's discarded pistol. She fired. The recoil jarred her shoulder, the sound explosive in the narrow corridor. The assassin slumped, his rifle clattering to the ground. She dropped to her feet beside Jae-Min, using a heavy metal floor lamp as a lever to heave the beam off his legs. He rolled clear, gasping, and immediately grabbed her hand, pulling her behind the cover of a solid oak sideboard just as a spray of bullets chewed into the wood above them. "You should have run," he rasped, his voice thick with debris and a sudden fierce wonder. "Shut up and reload," she snapped, her hands shaking as she pressed the spare magazine into his palm. For the next 10 minutes, the estate became a slaughterhouse. Jae-Min moved like a vengeful god, his movements a blaring symphony of violence, but he never let Amara drift more than an arm's length away. He shielded her with his own body, his heat a physical wall against the chaos. When the last of the Xinhua fell, a heavy, ringing silence descended over the ruins. Jae-Min stood in the center of the carnage, his shirt torn, his ink stained with blood that wasn't his own. He turned to her, the adrenaline-fueled fury in his eyes softening into something far more dangerous: total devotion. He walked over to the bar, miraculously still standing, and poured 2 fingers of bourbon into a cracked glass. He took a swallow, then handed it to her. His hand covered hers on the glass, his thumb tracing the line of her knuckles. "You saved me," he murmured, his gaze searching hers. "You had the phone. You had the chance to let them take me out. Why didn't you?" Amara took a sip, the bourbon burning a path down her throat, grounding her. She looked at the blood on her hands, then up at the man who had become her world's axis. "Because they aren't you," she whispered.
Jae-Min didn't speak. He simply pulled her into him, his arms a gilded cage she no longer wanted to escape. By saving the Reaper, she had signed her soul over to the dark, and as his heart beat against hers, she knew there was no going back. She was no longer a witness to his world, she was the heart of it. The smoke from the attack had barely cleared before a different kind of cold settled over the estate. It wasn't the chill of the night air, but the arrival of the elders, the grey-haired architects of the Kang syndicate who ruled from the shadows. They sat in the dim light of the surviving library, their faces as stony as the statues in the garden. Jae-Min stood before them, his hand resting possessively on the back of the chair where Amara sat, her silhouette a defiant contrast against the charred walls. "The girl is a poison, Jae-Min," the eldest among them spoke, his voice like dry parchment. "She is the sister of the man who signs our arrest warrants. Because of her, blood has been spilled on your doorstep. The Xinhua saw a weakness and they struck it." "She saved my life," Jae-Min said, his voice a low, warning rumble. His grip on the chair tightened, his knuckles white. "She isn't a weakness. She's the only one in this room with the spine to fire a gun when it mattered." "She is a liability," another elder countered, leaning forward into the light. "The syndicate does not survive on sentiment. It survives on fear. Your men are whispering. They say the Reaper has been tamed by a commissioner's daughter. If you keep her, you invite a coup. If you keep her, you prove you have gone soft." The room grew suffocatingly quiet. Amara felt the weight of their judgment, a dozen pairs of eyes looking at her as if she were a defect in a machine. She looked up at Jae-Min, expecting to see the calculating boss, the man who lived by the rules of survival. Instead, she saw a man on the edge of a precipice. "Give her to us," the elder commanded. "A blood sacrifice to mend the rift. Her life for the stability of the empire. Prove your loyalty to the dragon on your ribs, or lose the right to lead it." Jae-Min's shadow stretched long across the floor. For a moment, the silence held the tension of a wire about to snap. Amara felt a cold bead of sweat track down her spine. This was the ultimatum, the crown or the girl. The world he had built from ash, or the woman who had seen the fire inside him. Slowly, Jae-Min reached down, his hand sliding from the chair to Amara's shoulder. His touch wasn't a goodbye, it was an anchor. He looked the elders in the eye, his expression shifting into something more terrifying than the Reaper they knew. It was the look of a man who had already decided to burn his own house down.
"You speak of loyalty," Jae-Min whispered, the sound carrying the weight of a death sentence. "But you forget who built this empire. If you want her head, you'll have to take mine first. And I promise you, by the time you reach me, there won't be a syndicate left to lead." The fog at the shipping docks was thick, smelling of salt and wet iron, swirling around the rows of towering containers like ghosts. Jae-Min stood at the edge of the pier, the wind whipping his dark hair across his brow. In front of him stood the syndicate's private army, their weapons leveled. Behind him, the blue and red strobe lights of the police force began to cut through the mist. At the center of it all stood Samuel Okoye, his brother's face twisted in a mask of duty and desperation. "Step away from her, Kang!" Samuel roared, his voice cracking over the megaphone. "Let her go and maybe you survive the night." Jae-Min didn't move. His hand was locked in Amara's, their fingers white-knuckled and inseparable. He looked at the syndicate elders, who stood in the shadow of a crane, waiting for him to break. Then he looked at Samuel, the law incarnate. He was trapped between two fires, with no path back to the man he used to be. They won't stop, Samuel, Amara whispered, her eyes searching Jae-Min's. If you take him, the syndicate kills us both. If he stays, they destroy you to get to him. Jae-Min turned to her, his gaze softening into a look of absolute, terrifying clarity. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small remote detonator, the fail-safe for the massive freighter docked behind them, loaded with the syndicate's entire quarterly wealth. I told them I'd burn it all, he murmured to her. He looked at the elders and raised the remote. The Empire is gone. Consider this my resignation. He pressed the button. A series of muffled thuds preceded a blinding wall of fire that erupted from the ship's hull. The shockwave sent the syndicate soldiers scrambling and forced the police to shield their eyes. In the chaos of orange flames and billowing black smoke, the world turned to white noise. Jae-Min didn't look back at the burning millions. He grabbed Amara and dove toward the dark waters where a sleek, unmarked boat waited in the shadows of the pier. They hit the water together, cold, biting, and liberating. When they surfaced minutes later, far beyond the reach of the dock lights, the city was a distant, glowing silhouette. Jae-Min pulled her onto the deck of the getaway vessel, both of them gasping, drenched, and alive. He reached up, carrying the silk tie from his neck and casting it into the sea. The Reaper was dead. Amara leaned against him, watching the fire she had helped ignite. She had lost her safety, her brother's protection, and her place in the sun. But as Jae-Min pulled her into his heat, his ink-stained arms wrapping around her like a vow, she realized she hadn't been captured at all. "Where do we go?" she asked, her voice steady. Jae-Min looked out at the vast, dark horizon, a place where no one knew his name and no rules existed to keep them apart. "Wherever the fire can't find us," he said, and for the first time he smiled, a real, broken, beautiful thing. The boat cut through the waves, disappearing into the velvet night, leaving the world to wonder how a man who had everything chose a girl who was off limits, and why he'd do it all again.